In the United States, the Supreme Court is set to hear a landmark case that could upend Donald Trump's bid to return to the White House. Today, the country's highest court will hear arguments on Colorado's decision to kick Trump off the upcoming primary ballot over his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Our Washington bureau chief, Jackson Proskow, is outside the Supreme Court right now. Jackson, we appreciate this. So a historic case, obviously. What exactly are the justices being asked to decide?
Good morning to you, Anthony. Perhaps the biggest election-related case that the Supreme Court has taken up since Bush v. Gore back in 2000. The court has to decide a number of things. The main question here is whether Trump is eligible to be remaining on the ballot in the election, or if he can be kicked off, as Colorado's Supreme Court has said he can be. The real question here is, did Donald Trump engage in an insurrection? Because the Colorado Supreme Court ruled that he did, and that he should be removed from the ballot for violating Article 14, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which essentially disqualifies anyone who engaged in an insurrection from holding public office, from appearing on the ballot. So that's question one the Supreme Court has to decide. Did Trump violate that section of the Constitution? Question two they have to figure out is, did Trump engage in an insurrection? And part of the argument being made by Trump's legal team is that, look, Trump has never been convicted of engaging in an insurrection. Yes, there's a criminal trial underway right now, but he was never convicted by the Senate during the impeachment proceedings. He hasn't been convicted in a court of law at this point. And so these are sort of the issues the court has to weigh in on here in deciding whether or not to uphold what Colorado's Supreme Court has already decided, which is that Trump cannot appear on the primary ballot in that state on Super Tuesday, which is March 5th.
Okay, so unprecedented. What would a win for either side mean, obviously?
Well, for Trump, a win, of course, would be vindication, essentially saying, look, it's up to voters to decide who becomes the president, not up to legislators. Also, that Trump's legal arguments here hold water, that he did not engage in an insurrection. But I sat down yesterday with the Colorado lawyer who fought and won the original case in that state and who will be arguing it here today. And he says, look, if their side is upheld, it will disqualify Trump. It will end his presidential bid, because they believe that this will essentially give a green light to states that have laws on the books that say that candidates who are ineligible under the Constitution can't appear on the ballot. And in those states that don't have laws like that, by the time the election is over in November and the Electoral College has to certify, some states will be legally barred from certifying a disqualified presidential candidate, which would be Donald Trump if this ruling is upheld. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns from both sides that if the Supreme Court is ultimately somewhat ambiguous in its decision here, that could spell a really messy series of legal fights right across the country. So it'll be really interesting today to watch the arguments and see which way the justices are heading and how much of this case, which specific aspects of this case they feel that they need to take up. By the way, Anthony, the clock is ticking here because, as I mentioned, Super Tuesday is March 5th in Colorado. They're hearing the arguments today. They likely need a decision here in just the next couple of weeks so that there's some clarity in Colorado and the other states coming down the line.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the urgency obviously is there. Normally cases can take months for a decision. So obviously timeline is of course important. But I understand this isn't the only Trump-related case headed to the Supreme Court. What else is going on?
That's right. On Tuesday of this week, we, of course, got that D.C. appeals court ruling about Trump's claim that he is immune from prosecution in the election interference case brought by special counsel Jack Smith. And, of course, the D.C. court says that Trump does not enjoy presidential immunity, but they gave a Monday deadline, this coming Monday, for Trump's team to file an appeal to the Supreme Court to see if the Supreme Court will take up the case. Trump has already said that he will be filing that appeal. Now, it's not clear if and when they will submit the paperwork. And then it becomes a question of whether or not the Supreme Court does in fact decide to hear that case. Now, in this case, odds are sort of 50-50 that they may stand by the lower court ruling and say there's nothing for us to look at here, but they may also decide to take it up. So that is another major case that could be before the Supreme Court, a question of how much power a president has. And that one is an interesting one, Anthony, because essentially Trump's argument is that he is beyond the reach of the Supreme Court. You have to wonder how the justices, including the ones that Trump appointed, there are 3 of them, will feel about a case like that. That's
fascinating. The political drama heading to the courtroom today. We appreciate this, Jackson. Thank you for that update. That is our Washington bureau chief, Jackson Proskow, joining us from the U.S. Capitol. Thank you again.